Good afternoon and welcome to the SILA Foundation's June webinar, Mastering the ABCs of Adjuster Licensing. My name is Julie Mendel and I'm the Education Trustee for the SILA Foundation. And before I introduce today's speaker, I have just a few housekeeping items for everybody. This webinar is about 1 hour in length and it is being recorded. Within the next week, you'll receive a link to the recording and a post-webinar survey that we would really appreciate you completing for us. We'd like you to mute your microphones and turn off your videos so the focus stays on our speaker. And we ask that you put your questions in the chat box. We are going to monitor those and pose them to our speaker on your behalf. This is a lengthy presentation, and so we will answer as many questions as we can in the time we have available. So just a little bit about today's presentation. There's no need to weather the storm alone when it comes to adjuster licensing requirements. They're as easy as ABC and 1, 2, 3. And today, Kaitlyn Small is going to break down those complexities of adjuster licensing, provide an in-depth review of recent state changes, and discuss hot topics in the adjuster licensing space. She's going to provide some best practices to help you streamline your licensing processes for maximum efficiency. Kaitlyn is the Director of Regulatory Compliance at RegEd. Having worked in the compliance space for over 10 years, she's a subject matter expert in licensing and registration requirements. She has a focus on producer, adjuster, reinsurance, intermediary, and agency licensing. At RegEd, Kaitlyn assists her registration and licensing teams with licensing transactions and regulatory issues. She monitors state regulatory changes and communicates with state divisions of insurance on issues that arise during the licensing process. She holds a degree from North Carolina State University. She's the chair of the SILA Adjuster Licensing Subgroup Steering Committee and has held a SILA Associate designation since 2020. So please join me in welcoming back to our stage one of my favorite presenters, Kaitlyn Small.
Thank you, Julie. Today we're going to talk about adjuster licensing, mainly mastering the ABCs of adjuster licensing. And what exactly does that mean? So when you look at the word adjuster itself, it is a little bit scary, especially if you have colleagues that mainly only handle producer licensing. I know I've spoken about how, I handle adjuster licensing and they don't want anything to do with it. They don't want to touch it with a 10-foot pole. It's way more complicated than it needs to be. But one of the things is that if you look at the word adjuster, each letter of the word adjuster will help you figure out and manage the complex aspects of adjuster licensing. So that's what I'm going to walk through today, is kind of breaking down the word adjuster and what each letter kind of will keep you appraised of to make sure that you are being mindful of in the licensing process. So the first letter in adjuster is A, which is going to stand for adjuster licensing types. I know that sounds like it's cheating because adjuster is the word we're defining and we're starting with adjuster licensing types, but this really is the foundation of your licensing journey. If you don't know what adjuster license type you're managing or what adjuster you are, it's really going to make things messy because you're not going to know what states are required, what those filing requirements look like. So when we talk about adjuster license types, there's 4 main types of adjusters. You have your independent adjusters, which are your individuals who are associated with an independent adjusting firm and are hired to adjust losses on behalf of an insurance company, which is a little bit different than a company or staff adjuster. And that's a term that can be used kind of interchangeably, company or staff, depending on the state. But that is a person who is an employee of an insurance company and performs various functions involved in handling the company's claims. Sometimes they're referred to as a salaried adjuster. And if you were just on the NAIC Adjuster Working Group call, we had a very lengthy discussion on the inclusion of the word salaried. But this is going to be somebody who works directly for the insurance carrier versus an independent adjuster who is handling the claims on behalf of the carrier. Public adjusters and CAT adjusters I like to include because when you go through the licensing process, these are terms you're going to see, and it's important to know the distinction between them and how they kind of play in the adjuster space. The public adjuster is going to be somebody who represents the insured or the policyholder. And then a CAT adjuster is somebody who is qualified to handle the claims, but not licensed in that state. So if a hurricane hits Florida and you're being deployed to handle claims because of that, Florida has some provisions there that you don't have to obtain the full license to make it a little bit easier to alleviate the stress load due to the catastrophe. So we're mainly going to talk about independent adjusters and staff adjusters in this presentation. And this is your high-level look at what those state licensing offerings are going to be. Your purple states are going to be your independent adjuster licensing offering states. Your yellow states are going to be those that offer both. And then this map has changed over the years. With Nevada, they offer 3 license types because they define staff a little bit differently. And then Iowa is our new participant to the adjuster group, where they have an independent offering and an optional staff. And so then the question kind of becomes, is what happens if I live in a non-licensing state like Colorado and I need to handle claims in another state? That brings us to the second letter in adjuster is D, which is going to be for designated home state. And a designated home state is essentially like you are designating another state as your resident state. So you're going to qualify for that as a quote unquote resident, which would mean you're going to be designating that as your home state. So you're going to secure that license, and then you're going to be able to use that in the licensing process to obtain non-resident licenses in other states. And one of the things that I get asked a lot is, what is the best DHS to have? And I don't want to be favoritism to one state or another, because it does kind of really depend on what your needs are, what claims and what states you need to be licensed in. But a good rule of thumb is to look for these 3 things in a designated home state. The NAIC Adjuster Working Group is really kind of pushing for a gold standard of what a DHS is. And these are 3 of the main criteria for that. What that's going to look like is you want to pick a DHS that has an exam requirement, whether that's a state exam or a designation is accepted. Fingerprints or a background check. Important that that a lot of states are asking for that now, and a lot of states are having requirements where if you don't have fingerprints in your home state, you have to do it for them. And then the third piece is that continuing education. 22 states that can be utilized as a DHS have a CE requirement. I know there's a lot of adjusters out there that try to, cheat the system, where I'm going to pick a DHS in a state that doesn't have a CE requirement. And that really kind of makes life more difficult obtaining licenses elsewhere and having to manage that CE piece, because you're not doing it in your DHS. States want to know where you're doing it. It just turns into a whole thing. So a good rule of thumb is to pick that DHS from the get-go that has a CE requirement, so that you don't have to worry about that. 2 of the most popular DHSs that meet this criteria are Texas and Florida. That's probably why they're the most popular. They're the most widely accepted because they have a very strong hold in these 3 categories. And then some just best practices when it comes to a designated home state, things to be considerate of those CE requirements, whether or not that DHS has it. Be mindful of reciprocity. So California can technically be used as a DHS, but California in and of itself has some reciprocity issues, so that might not be the best choice. And then there's some states with specific DHS reciprocity where you have to have a DHS in that state to get a license there. They will not issue you a license if you hold a DHS that's not one of those states. And there are a handful of states that cannot be used as a DHS. I have South Carolina listed here with an asterisk because, and I'll speak to this later in the presentation, they passed a bill which is going to require continuing education. And fingerprints. So that's going to probably change their status and whether or not they can be used as a DHS. So more to come on that as we monitor what's going on in South Carolina. But as of right now, because there is not that CE piece or that fingerprint piece, it cannot be used as a DHS. And then Arizona does not recognize a DHS. So regardless of which state you pick, they will make you take their state exam. And then just some kind of tips on, how do I determine somebody's DHS? PDB is a great resource. There's been a big push on uniformity and how states are reporting that DHS data. So being mindful of the license class section on the PDB or the designated home state box within the license record will show you either whether that state is reporting itself, which means that it is the DHS, or what state the DHS or what state the non-resident license has on file for the DHS. So for the example for John Doe, his North Carolina license is reporting that he has a Texas DHS, and that is what they have on file. So if that information is wrong, you'll have to reach out to the state to correct that. So the next letter in adjuster is J, and that brings us to jurisdiction challenges. And each type of adjuster license is going to kind of exhibit its own set of challenges. And independent adjusters tend to have more issues because there are more states involved. There's 35 licensing states that offer independent adjuster licenses. And they have some additional filing requirements. The state of Florida is going to require an appointment, and there's a handful of states that have affiliations. And part of the reason why independent adjusters are facing a little bit more challenges is because there's states that don't have continuing education. There's 5 states that don't, and so that creates a bit of a challenge in terms of, if you're a resident of that state, how that's going to impact your licensing journey. And then the workers' compensation LOA is a bit of a tricky one to navigate in and of itself. Not every state offers it. It's a bit of an issue trying to get licensed in other states if you are a resident with that. And one of the other things is retaliation. And that word sounds very aggressive. I wish there was a softer word that we could use to talk about this exam stuff. And it's not a secret that it's California, New York, and Hawaii. So essentially, if you have adjusters that are residents of those 3 states, they're going to have a little bit more of an uphill battle obtaining licenses elsewhere. And the reason for that is that those 3 states require every applicant to take their exam to obtain a license in that state. It doesn't matter if you're a resident, a DHS, a non-resident applicant, you have to take their exam. And so what happens is there's a handful of states, which is Alabama, Florida, North Carolina, Oklahoma, and Oregon, will require their state exam from one of those applicants to obtain a license in that state. This is usually derived from language within their statutory requirements or regulations. That's usually along the lines of they will grant a license if the applicant's home state grants our residents licenses on the same authority. And because if you're an Alabama resident applying for California, you have to take the California exam. Alabama is going to make you take their exam. So there is a little bit of wiggle room with North Carolina. They will accept proof of an exam from a reciprocal state. So if you are a California resident and you've already taken the Oklahoma exam and your Oklahoma license is active and good standing, you can provide that score report to North Carolina to waive the exam. And then Florida has some conditional reciprocity depending on what your non-resident licenses look like, whether or not you can waive that exam. And then staff adjusters, a little bit easier of a path. There's less states involved because of that. You don't have to worry about California or New York. So it's a little less of, moving parts to it, but there still are some things to take into consideration. You have Iowa and Nevada that offer the optional company staff adjuster, and Nevada defines their staff adjuster differently when it comes to workers' comp. So that is something to pay attention to if you are looking at Nevada, kind of what is their offering, just kind of doing a little bit more digging into how each of those is defined. It will help in the long run. And then Georgia is a bit unique in the sense that they have a staff adjuster registration. So they don't get licensed in Georgia. There's like a portal where they get associated to the carrier. That's not to say they can't get the adjuster license in Georgia. It's just not required. And this all was pretty streamlined until a few years ago, which is probably the biggest jurisdiction challenge that staff adjusters are facing. That essentially these 3 states, New Mexico, Wyoming, and Rhode Island, kind of reevaluated their reciprocity in the sense that a staff adjuster must obtain an independent adjuster license in their resident state if their resident state does not restrict a staff adjuster from obtaining it. So the longest time the guidance was, I'm a Michigan resident, but I work for a carrier. I don't have an offering in my state. I can go ahead and get a Texas DHS. Well, this has kind of tipped that guidance on its upside down because now you have to take into consideration, if I'm that Michigan resident, do I have a claim load or claims in these 3 states? Because if I do, I'm going to need to hold a Michigan resident license and not the DHS in order to be eligible to obtain these licenses. So it really kind of takes a lot more mental load and managing kind of what that's going to look like from your licensing eligibility as a staff adjuster. Independent adjusters, it's a lot more black and white. If you're a resident of an independent adjuster licensing state, that's the resident license you're going to get. Resident of a non-licensing state, you get the DHS. But for staff adjusters, it's kind of more of an evaluation on a case-by-case basis. If you live in one of those yellow states, that's fine that they offer that staff company adjuster license. That's the resident license you'll get. But if you're a resident of an independent adjuster only state, it's a little bit more thought process of, can I get that DHS? You certainly could in that situation if you don't handle claims in New Mexico, Rhode Island, or Wyoming, get that Texas DHS. Or if you need to handle claims in those 3 states, they're going to want to see the resident license. So just kind of some things to navigate on the staff adjuster side that independents don't have to worry about so much. And we can't get through a presentation about adjusters unless we talk about uniformity. So uniformity is one of those buzzwords that it comes up a lot when we talk about adjusters. And we can't talk about uniformity without talking about reciprocity. These two kind of go hand in hand. And there's been a lot of growth in this area when it comes to both of these terms. But there still is a long way to go. When it comes to uniformity, when we talk about even just license types of independent or company staff adjusters, it's not uniform. You have your independent adjuster only states, and then you have 17 states that offer both license types, but they don't all do it the same. So you have 12 of those states are going to offer one adjuster license that's more of an umbrella. It encompasses both an independent or staff adjuster license. It's that only offering there. It doesn't matter who you're working for. That's the one that covers both independent or staff. But there are 5 states that offer 2 separate licenses. So when you go in to apply, you're going to see an independent adjuster offering and then a company adjuster offering. And that's Iowa, Kentucky, New Mexico, Nevada, and West Virginia. So just be mindful when you're applying for things, because I know that one of the issues is that people will sometimes just click a button and they're clicking the wrong adjuster license, and then it turns into a whole process to have to convert it to the right one because they selected the wrong license type. And lines of authority are another thing that has come a long way, but there's still some challenges around that. Your most common lines of authority you're going to see in the adjuster licensing space are going to be that property casualty, workers' comp, and crop. Crop isn't really something we see a lot through SILA. It's very niche, but it is a very common offering you will see throughout the states. But then there's a non-uniform approach to these lines of authority. Some states define them as all lines, and that's just what shows on your license, or none. And that can get confusing from where, what does that look like? What does that mean to another state? You're limited to resident state for a non-resident. And then you have limited lines. So your motor vehicle, accident, health, auto, and then New York has a slew of niche limited lines. And these can pose a challenge if you have kind of a more focused scope in claim handling. Getting a license in another state with one of these limited lines is a bit more of an issue because they're not uniform. So states are going to be hesitant to issue an all lines or a PC license because that grants you more of an authority in their state than you have in your home state, which kind of turns into
Sorry about that, everyone. We'll give Kaitlyn a couple minutes to get back on the call, hopefully. Julie, are you still there?
I am.
Okay. Question keeps popping up in the chat if the slides will be available after the call, and yes, they will be provided when the recording is put out there for everyone.
We have a fun fact in the comments. Fun fact while we're waiting, New Mexico lets you apply for an independent adjuster license when they have a staff adjuster license, but Kentucky makes you surrender, and I can't see the rest, the staff adjuster license through their portal before you can apply for a Kentucky independent adjuster license. That's a mouthful.
Yeah.
Anybody else have fun facts? Throw them out there.
Are you guys able to hear me?
There she is.
Hey, there you are.
Sorry, you would not believe that I just had a power surge, and so I let me pull this back up, and we will continue. I was not planning for that, but I guess that's how it works. You just gotta be prepared for whatever, especially in life and adjuster licensing. So, all right, we are back up. Hopefully, you all can see my screen, and
Yes, we can see your
does
screen.
not happen again. So what was I talking about? Lines of authority. So just be mindful of kind of, limited lines of authority, what that's going to mean for your reciprocity and eligibility and getting those licenses in other states. Workers' compensation is an issue in and of itself. There's a lot of issues with it in terms of not every state licensed that. There's a handful of states where it's not even managed by the Division of Insurance. They don't deal with it. And so that can become a problem with how do you get that in a non-resident state? And then you have a handful of states where it's actually considered an all lines license if you hold PC, because workers' comp falls under the casualty line. So you have an issue obtaining a license in a non-resident state for workers' comp because they don't see it on your license defined completely. And it's kind of a push and pull of explaining the PC authority covers workers' comp, even though I don't have it on my license. I could talk about workers' comp challenges all day. Maybe that can be the topic of discussion for next year's webinar. But that's not to say that we haven't come a long way. Over the past decade, there's been a lot of changes in this space. And kind of, where there were states that did not offer workers' comp, there's states that now offer it. And there has kind of been a little bit more clear definition in lines of authority of converting from a none or an all lines to defining PC and workers' comp. So the next letter is going to be S for state requirements. One of the questions I also get a lot is like, okay, I have my license. Am I just good to go to handle claims? And that's really going to depend on the state. There might be additional things that you have to do. And New Mexico and Florida are two examples of that. So Florida and New Mexico are the only two adjuster states that are going to require appointments. New Mexico, that is a staff only requirement. Your independent adjusters do not have to do this. It is a staff adjuster only requirement because New Mexico is a state that offers the two adjuster types. Florida is a state where that is one adjuster license, and everybody has to hold an appointment there. Those appointments do renew on a biennial basis. So, Florida's not a state that license renews, but that appointment is going to require a renewal. Now, your independent adjusters are going to need to be affiliated in a few states. So Maine, New Mexico, again, your staff adjusters don't have to worry about the affiliation. Oregon, Utah, and Washington. And New Mexico and Washington are two states that are going to require them to be renewed. Maine, Oregon, and Utah, there's not a renewal process for those affiliations, but New Mexico and Washington, you'll need to make sure those get renewed. And then just some additional state supporting documentation you're going to run across in the licensing process for a handful of states. Georgia and Alabama are going to require some kind of proof of citizenship. Fingerprints for non-residents, Florida, everyone's going to have to submit them. But there's a few states that have a contingency that fingerprints will be required if the resident state does not have a fingerprint requirement. California and Iowa are but South Carolina is one that we will need to kind of wait and see what the bulletin details in terms of how they're going to roll this out. But the language in the bill states that if your home state doesn't have fingerprints, you need to do fingerprints for South Carolina. Bond requirements for California and Iowa, there's been some changes there in terms of how you can meet the financial responsibility requirement, but there is still something that needs to be done. So that's in Iowa, that's going to be an independent adjuster only thing. Again, staff adjusters are optional in Iowa and they are not subject to that financial responsibility. And then you have the miscellaneous filings, which is going to be the exam exemption attestation form for Iowa. And then Louisiana and Rhode Island are two states that have kind of had some issues with applicants from Texas and New York, where they're going to request proof that those applicants actually live in those states. So driver's licenses will be required to submit proof that you actually do live there. And then the last three letters of the word adjuster really kind of bookend the whole licensing process in general. So TER is going to stand for timely file your education and renewal. Comes at the end of the word, comes at the end of the licensing life cycle for handling your licensing compliance. And the main piece of this is continuing education. Nobody wants to do CE. I know that they all tend to wait to the last minute to do it, and it's always kind of a last minute scramble to get it in under the gun. If you just do it timely over your 2 years, you usually have 2 years to do it. So if you just do it slow and steady, it makes things a little less stressful at the end of your renewal cycle. So this is kind of a high level look at what states require CE. This map has gotten a lot bluer over time. There used to be a lot more yellow, surprisingly, but now we're down to just a very few states that do not have a CE requirement. The general standard for CE is going to be 24 hours, with 3 being ethics. But that, of course, the uniformity, it does not necessarily mean that every state does the same thing. Delaware is a 12-hour requirement, and Florida drops to a 20-hour requirement after you've had 6 years of licensure. There's also states that offer exemptions. So if you've held your license for 20 consecutive years, you might not have to do CE in that state. South Carolina has added that CE requirement. It is new for this year. It's still the details of that are still coming out. That I know Andrea is working on, the bulletin with her department and legal team to kind of make sure that we have all the information we need for this. So more to come on South Carolina. And then CE requirements do vary by state and DHS. So the good rule of thumb is that usually resident state and DHS, if you're using it as a DHS, are going to have the same CE requirement. With the exception is Georgia. Georgia residents have a CE requirement, but Georgia DHS do not. Kentucky does not have a CE requirement for their staff adjusters, but they do for their independent adjusters. So it's getting better, the CE piece here. More states are trying to add it, which is great to alleviate those headaches for those residents that live in those states. So this is definitely a part of the adjuster licensing space that is evolving a lot faster than other pieces. And I am happy about that because it makes it a little bit more uniform. Renewal dates to keep in mind, usually most states are going to fall under a birth month renewal. So that's, whether that means that it renews on even years based on your year of birth or issuance of your license. You're looking at a 2-year end of birth month renewal cycle. Of course, again, lack of uniformity. Nevada renews on a 3-year cycle and Arizona on a 4-year cycle. And Florida is going to be that perpetual state, but it is contingent on your appointment renewal and then your CE compliance, if that is where you're completing your CE. And then you have a handful of states that have very specific date renewals. My processing team calls these mass renewals because everyone is renewing in mass in these states all at once, which can get a little bit crazy and hectic in the spring. So just be mindful of those dates throughout the year, and you're managing these licenses, knowing that there's going to be higher volumes, at the end of March and April, depending on what types of states your individuals are licensed in. But one thing to note that almost every state is going to have a CE renewal date due at or around their time of renewal, with the exception of North Carolina. So if you are a North Carolina resident or DHS, your CE is going to be due biennially on your birth year, not the 4/1 annual renewal date. So those are two things to keep in mind and keep track of. Is North Carolina residents and DHS are going to have 2 separate dates. And you don't want to miss either of those, because then you're dealing with reinstatements, and that's not exactly fun. And some just best practices for the licensing process for the renewals is a common question is, I don't have a CE requirement in my home state. Am I exempt from CE in other non-resident states? It's going to depend. Some states are going to want to see that you're completing your hours somewhere. They are aware that individuals sometimes will try to report, I'm using a DHS of New Hampshire, but they're actually not doing that because they're trying to circumvent a CE requirement. So a lot of states will still ask for that proof of CE. So one of the things that I know, I've talked to Courtney, so I don't want to single out Oklahoma, but it's not necessarily the elephant in the room, is that Oklahoma is a state that is going to want to see that. They want to see that you're doing your CE, that you don't get a free pass. They want to make sure that you're doing your CE somewhere. So a lot of individuals that are residents of those states that don't have a CE requirement will typically just do it in Oklahoma, because Oklahoma will have the transcript. It's on SBS. If when it comes to renew, they have it in their records. Just makes life a little bit easier because Oklahoma has that 24/3 ethics standard. And then another question is, I changed my DHS during my license cycle. Will it impact my renewal? Yes. If you change your DHS during the life cycle of your license, you need to notify the states. This can cause problems at time of renewal where you can't submit because it's causing a problem on the application because it's picking up that you don't have the right DHS or your DHS that you have on file is inactive. So just staying on top of notifying states of that change will alleviate, you're running up against a time clock in your renewal window, to have to avoid just having to deal with that added stress. And then just a good rule of thumb, not only with renewals, but just kind of across the board, is respond to state inquiries. I can't tell you how many times it'll be a situation where an adjuster or an agent's like, my license got revoked and I don't understand why. And then you reach out to the state and the state's like, we sent them 5 emails about this. That states don't want to be ignored. And you can alleviate a lot of headaches by responding to those inquiries. So just a good rule of thumb is don't let them get ignored. Make sure you're responding, so that you can kind of avoid any of those headaches that might come up. So whenever you're looking at adjuster stuff or you're panicking about adjuster requirements, you're not sure what to do, just remember kind of what each letter stands for, and that will kind of compartmentalize the process and make it a little bit easier to digest as you move through managing these licenses. Next, I'm going to move on to the state licensing changes. This year has been pretty lively in the adjuster licensing space in terms of things that have changed and requirements that are changing. And one of the big ones is going to impact staff adjusters. So Arizona passed a bill in April of this year that essentially allows a salaried employee of an insurer or MGA is eligible to be licensed in the state as an adjuster without taking the state adjuster exam if they meet all of the following. So this bill was passed to kind of alleviate the challenges around that situation where you have adjusters that are residents of Arizona but have a Florida DHS because they work for a carrier. And when the New Mexico, Wyoming situation kind of occurred, what was a lot of adjusters were doing was converting their licenses. And you could do that from your DHS if you had a Texas DHS or a Florida DHS, and you lived in Michigan, you lived in, Idaho, you could transfer that license. Because Arizona does not recognize a DHS, what happened was every Arizona resident licensee was going to have to take the Arizona state exam because they could not transfer their DHS. So this was kind of in response to that, to allow a window for those individuals impacted by that to be able to be exempt from the exam. But you have to meet all of the following. Prior to the first of this year, you had to have been an Arizona resident and you had to have held an active DHS prior to the first of this year and qualified via state approved exam for the DHS. If you meet both of those qualifications prior to June 30th of next year, you will need to submit the application, pay the fee, complete fingerprints, and that will waive that exam. So this, you can't apply yet. It's not ready yet. I know that it was, I think we have a hard date now of 9/12/2026 is when the target date to roll this out is. I know Arizona's working kind of on a bulletin to get information out to the public. That this is another thing they're trying to do is make sure that we can do this on NIPR. Nobody wants to do paper. So an electronic filing will be critical to make this streamlined for a lot of people. And fingerprints will be required. That is one thing that is very clear in this bill, and this requirement is that you will need to comply with the fingerprints, and those are completed via field print. With this, it is going to create a new line of authority for staff adjusters. So adjuster licensing in Arizona looks like an adjuster license type with an adjuster line of authority. This is going to create an adjuster license type with a staff adjuster line of authority. And there's been a handful of questions about that. Now that there's that staff adjuster line of authority in Arizona, does that mean staff adjusters are required to obtain it? No, the definition of the adjuster is not changing. This is an optional offering to assist those that want to convert from that DHS to Arizona without having to take the state exam. Independent adjusters are going to be out of luck with this. I know that there's a handful of them that are like, I moved to Arizona, I have a DHS, can I waive the exam? No, it is very clear this is only for staff adjusters. Independent adjusters will not be eligible for this. Another question that came up is, I think it's a common theme for us licensed coordinators and us in compliance that we like things to be consistent. So if you have individuals that are eligible for this, the question kind of became, well, I have some staff adjusters that tested for the full adjuster license of adjuster license type, adjuster line of authority. Do I need to convert them? Is this going to be a problem? You don't have to switch the license unless you choose to. But if you are going to choose to do that, the individual must have had their DHS remain active prior to the first of this year, which a lot of those individuals probably surrendered it to get their Arizona resident license. And you would have to surrender the adjuster license with the adjuster LOA to be able to apply for the staff adjuster license. Just warning that if you are to do that, the staff adjuster LOA is more limited in scope. So you don't necessarily have to do that. It might just be easier to leave your existing licensee population as is and then kind of handle these other new applicants that fall into this bucket a little differently. But just kind of some questions that came up that hopefully will kind of alleviate a little bit of confusion around that. And then what happens if I do not apply for the staff adjuster LOA prior to June 30th of next year? Then they just have to qualify for the full license with the exam. This staff adjuster LOA is not going to be offered after June 30th of next year. So it is a temporary offering. It is an optional offering. So more to come on this. I know Arizona's working on that. The way that their legislative session ends is that this goes into effect 90 days after it ends, which is supposed to end on the 30th of this month. So it's kind of been a little bit of a waiting game for crossing that finish line before we can obtain a little bit more information on this. And then South Carolina has had a lot of changes as well. This has been, I feel, years in the making for South Carolina, is that they passed Bill 196 in May, and it went in effect immediately. But don't panic that you're not doing something or you're missing a requirement, because South Carolina has not officially rolled this out yet. They are working on it diligently. South Carolina has been really great in their involvement with the adjuster licensing subgroup, with taking a lot of kind of questions so that they can build that information into their bulletin to make sure they're addressing that information that everybody wants to know. But kind of the highlights around South Carolina changes are going to be that they are going to require continuing education. And but the unique thing about their CE piece, it is a 24-3 standard CE requirement, 3 being the ethics. But one of the unique things about this is that it's going to require individuals that adjust workers' comp claims to complete 3 hours of education specific to workers' comp claims. And so that will be built into the full 24 hours. But South Carolina is a unique state where they have workers' comp falls under casualty. So if you handle workers' comp in South Carolina, you can either handle that on the workers' comp line of authority itself or under the casualty line of authority. And the clarification around this CE piece is that regardless of what line of authority you're handling that workers' comp under, this will apply because it is based on how the claims that you are handling. It is not based on the line of authority. So I'm sure that there will be more to come on this as South Carolina works on their bulletin, but wanted to make that kind of distinction on that workers' comp element there. Fingerprints as well. Fingerprints are going to be required for resident and DHS. If they are able to begin being used as a DHS, fingerprints would be required for that. And they also have the language that is for non-resident applicants. If your home state does not have a fingerprint requirement, the individual will need to meet that fingerprint requirement for South Carolina. And then they are removing a retaliatory fee. So South Carolina has always been, if your resident state is more expensive to get licensed in than South Carolina, that's the fee you're going to pay. That's going away once this is rolled out. It's going to be a standard fee of $100 for individuals and $50 for business entities. Fingerprint vendor is going to be Identigo. For that's what it is for producers. So the kind of understanding is that's probably what it's going to be for adjusters, but just kind of some things we're keeping an eye on until we can get a little bit more information from South Carolina. So be patient; they're working on it, and I'm sure that will be communicated shortly. Another change is Alaska. So at the first of this year, they became reciprocal with designated home states, but only certain ones. And those are going to be your ones that are on the screen here. That if you have a DHS in one of these states, you don't have to take the Alaska exam anymore. This change that went into effect on June 12th is related to the application process. You used to have to submit the paper application to avoid having to take the exam, but NIPR has updated the capabilities where if you have a DHS in one of these states, you can now submit the application electronically instead of having to submit the paper application. So the next is going to be Iowa with their financial responsibility change. They passed a bill to amend their financial responsibility requirements. So when they first required licensing, it was you have to hold an individual bond for independent adjusters. And it is a very lengthy process. They're very expensive. So Iowa kind of went back to the drawing board to say what they can do to make this a little bit easier for everybody. So what came out of that is there are 3 acceptable forms of financial responsibility now. And these are going to be your 3 options. You can keep the individual bond if you want to, or if you have an independent adjusting firm license in Iowa that has the bond with it, you can now list individuals on that bond and not have to have them hold an individual bond. Option B is going to be a professional liability or E&O insurance policy, and option C is going to be an irrevocable letter of credit. Now, if you want to switch individuals to the entity bond, there is a form that is going to be required. It's called the Attestation of Financial Responsibility Individual Adjuster Form. It is a form that is going to need to be signed by the adjuster themselves and a representative of the business entity. And that is going to be required for the switch over from the individual policy to the new financial responsibility. And the way to make that change is you're going to need to email Iowa. You're going to need the attestation form with those signatures and the copy of whatever the financial responsibility is, the entity bond, the E&O, letter of credit. And this is probably the most important part of this is the subject line is how they are going to link this up with the individual's record. You must put the adjuster's name and NPN in that subject line if they are an existing licensee or the transaction number if it's a pending application. This is because this is how they're able to find this information when you send it to them. Do not send them a spreadsheet because it's going to get lost. It's not something they can easily locate. Every individual is going to have sent their specific email with their specific name, their documents, one at a time to Iowa because that's how they're able to keep this streamlined for their process. So don't send them a spreadsheet, send them one at a time. It's just easier for them to enter it in their system if we all follow this process. And then I did just want to talk about some things that are kind of trending in this space. I've been involved with the SILA Canadian Licensing Task Force. So Canadian licensing has kind of become a bit of an interesting topic from the producer side, but also kind of seeing a little bit of parallels in some challenges that they're experiencing there that we are also experiencing here. So Canadian insurance adjusters they're in demand, but they're having a bit of an issue with recruiting new people. Canada's currently experiencing a crisis where they're having more climate change related disasters, and they've previously relied on U.S. Adjusters to assist with that. And because of political tensions between U.S. and Canada, they're trying to kind of re-examine what they can do on their side of the border to alleviate the excessive claims that are occurring there. But also part of this is the retirement and resignation. They're anticipating that they're going to need to hire at least 10 to 20% more adjusters in the next 5 years based on the national claim load that's occurring in Canada. And the issue is that they're retiring at a very alarming rate, which is we're seeing that trend in the US that adjusters are leaving, whether that's they're just retiring or they're just very stressed out, they're burnt out, they don't want to do this anymore, and they're leaving. And so what's happening is that young people don't really want to work in the insurance industry. I don't really know why. I think it's fun, but it's not as glamorous to the younger population. So individuals are leaving the field and they're not being replaced as quickly as possible to alleviate this. So they're kind of evaluating what can they do on their end to fix this issue. And there's been a lot of pressure on CSRO, which is their kind of NAIC equivalent in Canada, that there's a coalition of 8 P&C associations that are calling for reforms to Canadians' adjuster licensing framework. And for those of you that don't handle anything in Canada, it is vastly different than how things are handled in the US. It is every province or territory has their own homegrown system, their own forms. That is how it's filed. There's not a central repository like we have with the PDB. It is very unique, individualized filing processes. And so there's a lot of pressure on their kind of oversight to streamline that, to make it a little bit easier, because they're kind of stating that the way that the existing framework is working now is it's preventing adjusters from moving freely, and that's creating a bottleneck of claims processing and disaster response. So Ontario has kind of taken the reins on this for their own province to streamline it a little bit easier. So in Ontario, there's a process where you have to take an exam for their license that used to have to be completed before you applied. Now there is an option to apply, and then you have 6 months to complete that exam. So you can handle the claims while you're studying for that exam to at least get adjusters in the door to be able to help and start working while they finalize those requirements. And Quebec is kind of doing something similar. They passed a bill recently this year that authorizes certain individuals to perform tasks that are usually reserved for claim adjusters, even if they don't have a certification to act in that capacity. So if you have an individual that holds an agent or broker license, somebody who was previously a claims adjuster, or somebody that has a claims adjuster license outside of Quebec, they can handle certain claims without having to obtain the actual license in that province. And Quebec has kind of also created a guideline for the use of AI, which I feel like in 2026, we can't have a presentation without talking about AI. So I apologize. I feel like we always talk about AI in the adjuster space, but it is interesting to see they've created a very detailed document on the guidelines around if you are using AI in your systems, what you're using it for claim handling, or for, on the producer side. And this is very, very similar to what has been created by the NAIC. So the NAIC has the Model Bulletin for Artificial Intelligence, and they recently had a publication that came out about, it was an industry survey. So it surveyed AI use across insurers, and it's a very detailed document that kind of shows where the AI adoption is across the country here. So 24 states have adopted this model bulletin. 15 of them are adjuster licensing states, just to kind of provide some guidance in terms of, national framework of where AI is trending, what, insurers and individuals should be aware of if they are utilizing AI. And one of the common themes with AI that I have seen through various conferences and other things that I've attended is that there's not really a lot of guidance when it comes to handling casualty or property claims. A lot of what is out there is related to health insurance claims. Last year, 17 states introduced legislation restricting the use of AI in insurance, and 2 states enacted those. But again, that was in regard to health insurance services that are basically stating that a human must be involved in the decision-making process. And that's kind of the sentiment that's been echoed in a lot of these conversations, is that, what exactly can AI do? What can it not do? And the common thread is that you have to have a human involved in the process. You can't rely on, the AI bot to be able to handle the claim in its entirety or make a decision on it, that there has to be a human that is actively involved in that process and reviewing it. And so Texas recently released a bulletin kind of reminding insurers and individuals that are handling, that are adjusters or agents on what their applicable laws and regulations are when using AI. It is extremely detailed. I really appreciated this from Texas, but there is a specific part in it that references the insurance code about adjusters. I've listed the other chapters in there that are referenced in it. I think it's a great resource if you're interested in looking at kind of, how they are expecting companies and firms to adhere to AI. It's really a wealth of information. And then we have just kind of an overlook of what the adjuster regulatory update is for what's going on in other states. Virginia introduced a bill this year to add a licensing requirement for company and independent adjusters. This has been kicked down the road till next session, which if it passes will kind of be like how we handled Iowa last year, where it's going to be a required state, but let's wait and see what happens with it before we start to panic on how we're going to incorporate that. Florida had a bill that was introduced that would require non-residents to complete 24 hours of Florida-specific CE annually, and that failed, which I think is a sigh of relief for everyone because it's difficult to get people to complete 24 hours on a 2-year cycle, let alone an annual cycle. New York still has a pending bill out there that they introduce every year about, adding CE or waiving the exam if you've completed a designation somewhere. And then Connecticut is the way that I want to word this. So Connecticut has passed or adopted revisions to the insurance statutes that are going to allow the DOI to make continuing education regulations for adjusters. So that doesn't necessarily mean that it has adopted a CE requirement. It is allowing the DOI to create that framework. I would be very surprised if Connecticut chooses not to do CE. I am fully anticipating that's going to be the case. But this is in its infancy stages in terms of kind of seeing where this is going to go. That, it's not, they don't have a CE requirement right now, but this opens the door for them to build that requirement and be able to implement it. So Connecticut's a state we're going to be watching and keeping an eye on in terms of what that's going to look like, what they're going to do with this ability now. And then just some additional adjuster educational opportunities I wanted to kind of just let you guys know about. Again, I'm hosting the adjuster licensing advanced class this year. The dates are August 12th and August 13th from 2:30 to 4:30. It's split over 2 days. And I'm co-hosting it with Melissa Britton from Adjuster Pro. And so this is a very interactive course. 4 hours seems like a lot, but it goes very quickly. It's very interactive. We go through a lot of, an overview of adjuster licensing requirement and resources, and it's very kind of case study scenarios. So we've kind of created a lot of common scenarios that we've run into in the licensing process that create challenges or might kind of challenge you to think outside of the box on how to handle. And we kind of dissect them as a group, discuss strategy on how to address this if you've ever run into it, and have really kind of good dialogue on what that's going to look like back and forth so that you can kind of take, if an attendee is handling it differently than you would, then you can use kind of that conversation to build it into your licensing processes. And then we do have the SILA National Education Conference that is going to be in Chicago this year, the week of October 26th. And we have 2 sessions that we are going to have that are sponsored by the Adjuster Licensing Subgroup Steering Committee. So our first session is going to be covering all the bases. It's kind of got a baseball theme because it's Chicago. And it's going to be a panel presentation. So we're going to talk a lot about, managing state changes, how that impacts industry, how that impacts states, how when one state changes something, how that creates a domino effect for other states, technology changes, AI part of the conversation. And then Tuesday, we're going to have the Adjuster Open Forum, which is more kind of freestyle, where it builds upon part of the conversation from what we've discussed in the panel presentation the day previously. And then also, if you have a question that you want to bring to the table to just see how everyone is handling, or if other people are having that issue, that's kind of an open floor situation where you can bring that up and pick other people's brains on how to handle that. And so that's all I have. Very impressed that I got through that, given the power went out halfway through. So appreciate everyone hanging in there. So Julie, I'll send it back to you.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions, and since we do have just a couple minutes, I want to see if we can get through them. If we can't, I will send them off to you and we'll get answers out to people. The first one was, can you speak to the Texas rule where if you've been licensed for several years, you are exempt from CE requirements? For example, had an adjuster resident of Michigan. Michigan didn't have a CE requirement, so she took her credits in Texas. She got the exemption from Texas, and then she needed to take her CE in California to keep that current. You may have addressed that. I'm not sure.
Yes. So California is a unique state where if you are a resident of a state that does not have a CE requirement and you hold a license in California, you need to do their hours. And so that is probably where that's coming from, is that even if you're that Michigan resident that's doing hours in Texas, California is going to need to see that you're doing their hours. It's just one of the quirks of California, unfortunately.
Okay. Can you provide a little clarity on the Iowa company bond increase for 41 plus independent adjusters, which is a move from the individual bond requirement some 6 months ago?
I don't think I understand. I know that the entity bond has tiers to it in terms of coverage depending on the adjusters, but I would probably have to reach out to Iowa to gain a little bit more clarity on that one.
Okay. Have you run into a state that has required an MGA to get a business entity's adjuster's license?
That I have not run into a state that has required that, but I don't typically handle MGAs, so I might not be the best to ask about that one. I don't know if anyone else on the call has experience with that.
The next one I think you've addressed, so I'm gonna go ahead and skip it. Will the South Carolina CE requirement also be for non-residents or only for South Carolina residents?
That one, I know South Carolina is still finalizing that, but their hope and their intention is to not kind of be very strict on that policing of it. That if you're doing it somewhere, it's that you don't have to do the South Carolina specific credits. But once that I know that bulletin's in process, and I'm very excited to see what it's going to say. That I'm sure that is going to be one of the questions that is addressed in there.
Okay, then I'll get one more in here before I sign us off. Is South Carolina rolling out an independent adjuster type?
My understanding is that the bill's not changing the license type. So their adjuster license, they are a state that has the adjuster license that encompasses both. And my understanding is that's not going to change. They're not going to split into two separate types. It's going to remain the same license.
Okay, great. So I hope I got all the questions. It's a lot of scrolling and watching and trying to listen. So I hope I got all the questions. If we didn't, you can go ahead and send your questions to Mary Ellen at the SILA Foundation, and we can get those to Kaitlyn and get answers back out to you. So Kaitlyn, as always, thank you so much for sharing your expertise on adjuster licensing and for being such a great friend to SILA and the SILA Foundation. We really appreciate you and your time this afternoon. As a reminder to everyone else, our webinars are free of charge. They are open to the public. We love it when you share our invitations. So watch for and complete the post-webinar survey, and please plan on joining us next month when we have a discussion on property and casualty insurance.
Thank you.